let's start with one of the biggest names out there, the Detroit Pistons, Andre Drummond, who has been rumored to Atlanta for at least a couple of weeks now. The latest report is basically indicating that the Hawks could have had this deal done, but are refusing to add a first-round draft pick. So, like, what are your thoughts on Drummond potentially going to Atlanta, or basically like Andre Drummond as a trade object in and of itself?
Yeah, he's a bit of a difficult guy to trade because if you're going to have him on your team, then you're going to have to be willing to accept that he's a different sort of player, that he's not your modern center. He's not the guy who can step out to the 3-point line and make 35% of his threes or defend guys out there as well. So if you're prepared to put yourself in a situation where you've got Andre Drummond and you're going to build an offense around him that is sort of counter to where the NBA is right now, then he could be useful. But you've got to be able to do that, and that's something that I think for the Hawks, as they look at what their situation is with Trae Young, and then with very little else around him right now, I think they're just looking to have quality NBA players there, and certainly Drummond is. But it would be interesting to see how Lloyd Pierce, the coach there, would be able to construct an offense with Trae Young on the perimeter and Andre Drummond inside.
Yeah, I mean, you also have John Collins there. He's an adequate 3-point shooter, I want to say. He's still not at that knockdown territory, and he still needs to get the ball moving inside as well. So the presence of Drummond would absolutely occupy some space there. Whereas unlike last year when you had Dwayne Dedmon who could step out and shoot the three, that just spaced the floor so well for Atlanta. So do you think that the issues with Drummond's game is going to limit his trade value?
Yeah, I think it already has. You know, the reality is, as much as Detroit has said they want to keep Drummond, that they've been listening to offers for him for about a year now. This started ahead of the trade deadline last year, where there was some discussion about Andre Drummond being a trade target. He's going to hit free agency in July. There are other teams that have him on the radar here. Cleveland has been one. Charlotte has been another. They've had interest in Drummond for a while now. So there's certainly interest, but like I say, it's if you're a team that considers yourself a contender, you've already got some high quality players. He's probably not the guy that you're going after right now. You're probably going after you're probably looking at teams that are rebuilding and trying to figure out their way. Those are the teams that are considering Drummond, and teams that need an identity. Teams also that have the cap space to re-sign him this summer. That's going to be nobody wants to give up a package that includes much of anything. If what they're going to get is just a few months of Andre Drummond, you got to be able to re-sign him as well.
And coincidentally, when you talk about rebuilding process, like Detroit would actually have to go into a rebuilding process after trading Drummond, because as currently constructed, they're not going to be a win-now team. They're not going to be, chasing a high seed in the playoffs. Blake Griffin is having arguably the worst contract or worst year of his career, and his contract is just enormous. So for them, this is basically hitting the reset button.
Yeah, and Detroit has gotten themselves into a pretty bad situation. Unfortunately for Dwayne Casey, the coach there, he'll probably wind up being the one who pays the price for it at some point. Even though this is all the Stan Van Gundy follies right now. This is all when he was sort of desperate to save his job, he made the trade for Blake Griffin, and that's really the reason why the Clippers are able to be a championship caliber team now, is because they're able to move that Blake Griffin contract after giving him a 5-year extension, which was a bad idea at the time. And we see why. We see why it was a bad idea. Yet they were able to move him to Detroit. That was probably the only trade they could have made for that contract. Because Stan Van Gundy, like I say, was so desperate at the time, and really you see the negatives that still lingers. I mean, Blake Griffin is 30. He's had knee problems throughout his career. He's had all sorts of injury problems. He still has 2 years left after this year, including his option year, and that's about $75 million over 2 years. So good luck trying to find a taker for that contract.
Like I always tell Brian, we just need $1 million. That's fine.
I'll split it. With you.
I would be all the good with that. So let's just wrap up on Blake Griffin. Is he even tradable at all, or would Detroit have to attach numerous assets just to get out of that deal?
Yeah, they would, and you'd have to find just the right situation, a team that's well below the cap, that would be willing to absorb that hit for 2 years, and there's probably a couple that would fit that bill. A team like Cleveland, that's still at least 2 years away in terms of its rebuild. They could take on Blake Griffin, and if he came with a number of picks. But if you're Detroit, you don't want to give away those picks. Right. You need those to rebuild yourself. So, it's a tough situation for them. It's not like they're on the cusp of competing. They just need to make a few moves. They need a full rebuild. They're not going to find anybody to take on that contract. Certainly not this year. Maybe next year when we get to the deadline, he's only got 1 year left on his deal. It becomes a little more palatable, but right now, that's not going to happen.
Yeah, it's a difficult situation for sure. I mean, if they were interested in keeping Andre Drummond along as well, I mean, you would have to basically earmark 26 million a year for him as well, and then they would be, well, to put it frankly, they would be screwed for quite a long time. So this trade for Drummond specifically right now, I mean, it makes sense that they're shopping him. It makes sense that they want to get out of that contract. Because of the Blake factor as well. It's a bad situation. It's going to take a couple of years for Detroit to bounce back. I mean, thank God they got Sekou Doumbouya in the draft, who, he was number 4 on my big board. I absolutely love to watch him play, and he's broken out a little bit recently. And with Drummond gone later on, if that happens with Atlanta or Charlotte or whoever is out there, he's going to have more space and more floor time, and he's going to get more experience as well. So maybe this is just what's necessary to move on.
Yeah, and I think that's a big part of it. And, Christian Wood, I think, has played pretty well for them as well. Yeah. And they'd like to see, some more of him. So, yeah, you want to start, once you fold in the cards, then you've got to have some players that you can show your fans, okay, this is what the future might look like. And that's what Doumbouya can be. That's what, hopefully if they can keep Christian Wood going forward, that would be a possibility there. So yeah, this is, they're still a long way from being anything close to competitive, but what they've got to find a way to maximize the assets that they have, whether it's Drummond or anybody else they might want to trade. Anybody from Derrick Rose to Tony Snell or anything that they can get for guys like that. They're in a position where they really do need to maximize what's on the roster and then be able to show fans, okay, this is where the future lies, and right now the future is still pretty barren.